Today's focus, industrialization, is a topic which history has proved time and time again as being crucial to the socio-economic development of any country or region. We need not go back to Britain's industrial revolution in the 18th century, nor to the more recent success stories of the East Asian tiger economies in the middle of the 20th century to see the importance of industrialization. The Chinese story has in the past 3 or 4 decades underscored the pivotal role which industrialization plays in the economic transformation of a country or region. That said, this evening's event is taking place amidst floundering but continuing attempts at industrialization in Africa. Most will agree that the question is not whether African countries should embark on the industrialization, but rather how they are to do so. Which is the precise reason why we have all gathered here today. We want to examine those factors that have impeded industrial development in African countries to date, but more importantly, to talk about how these can be overcome, to come up with strategies we can collectively work to execute. The focus must be on clear, practical, and practicable solutions and strategies that we can execute. There have been many reasons for the 1% that constitutes Africa's collective industrial output relative to the rest of the world, a pitiful sum, given that Africa has slightly more than 15% of the world's population and produces a considerable amount of the resources which fuel industrial activity across the world, resources which are non-replenishable. As Dr. Yumkela wrote in his article in the May issue of the Globalist magazine, we are in danger of playing our strongest hand, our natural resources, and losing. Commentators and academics cite such internal factors as an imbalanced focus on export-oriented industrialization and the subsequent neglect of domestic markets as reasons why the levels and composition of imports have remained largely unchanged, or a concentration of manufacturing activities on consumerist production instead of capital and intermediate goods have been cited also. And these continue to undermine the African industrialization process. Others have pointed to external factors such as the trade liberalization policies of the IMF's structural adjustment programs, which immaturely expose African infant industries to foreign competition. And some assert that the continuing legacy of colonization and neo-colonization is the reason for the disparity in the levels of industrialization across the continent, given that countries such as Zimbabwe and South Africa benefited from the technological know-how of the European settlers, unlike counterpart countries where the colonizing nation's primary objective was to extract and process overseas. There is little doubt that the emergence of China and India imposed on Africa's aim to industrialize and export. A UN study showed that the value of the sub-Saharan Africans' clothing exports to the US reduced by 26%, with South Africa alone experiencing a decline of 53%, whilst China's exports grew by 84% in the same period. However, as China begins to see a decline in its position as the world's largest exporter of low-cost manufacturing goods, we must begin to ask what strategies Africa ought to formulate and implement in order to take advantage of this emerging opportunity and improve in previous attempts. An important disclaimer is that, of course, we speak about Africa, but there are many countries in Africa, just as there are many Africans. We say Africa not to be lazy or reductionist, but to expand the skin of the discussion, to address the many countries that find themselves linked by geography and history and to different degrees, similar issues and experiences. It is thus that we can speak about industrial strategies for Africa. And to delve fully into this topic, we are grateful for the presence of a most distinguished and authoritative panel. I ask that they kindly come up to the stage as they are called. Our moderator for the event is Alexis Flynn, Africa editor, Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones. He will be moderating tonight's event. Thank you. I'll just say a little bit about Alexis. Alexis was born in South Africa and worked at 2 of the Eastern Cape's oldest newspapers, Grokot's Mail and the Daily Dispatch, before traveling to the Democratic Republic of Congo as a freelancer. After a stint as a special correspondent in London for South Africa's independent newspapers, he joined Dow Jones in 2006 as a copy editor, then a reporter, covering 2 of the UK's biggest companies, BP and Shell. Alexis earned his BA at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. Our keynote speaker would be Dr. Kande Yumkela, who is the Director General, United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Dr. Kande was appointed Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, having previously worked in various high-level policy positions in UNIDO. He was reappointed for a second four-year term in office in December 2009. Prior to working at UNIDO, Yumkela was the Minister for Trade, Industry and State Enterprises of the Republic of Sierra Leone from 1994 to 95. From 87 to 96, he held various academic positions at Michigan State University and University of Illinois. In recognition of his leadership and his passion for energy and environment-related causes, Yumkela was appointed as chair of UN Energy in 2008 by the UN Secretary General. UN Energy brings together all organizations dealing with energy issues. As its chairman, Yumkela brought a renewed and vital focus to global energy issues, and he helped to coordinate the UN response to energy issues. In September 2011, Yumkela was appointed by the UN Secretary General as co-chair of the high-level group on sustainable energy for all. Can we have Dr. Yumkela come on stage, please? Mr. Hindin, lead economist, operations and strategy, office of the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. He is also lead author, World Bank's Light Manufacturing in Africa publication. His role in tonight's lecture would be to act as a respondent to the keynote speech. Mr. Hindin is currently lead economist in the office of the Senior Vice President. He is in charge of advising its management and staff and strategy, economic policy, and related operational issues for Southern Africa, Central and Western Africa. In that capacity, he worked in Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Benin, Niger, Togo, and a number of other countries. Between 91 and 98, he served as principal economist in the finance complex, working on country risks of large economies in Asia, China, and Indonesia, and Latin America. His work and portfolio concentration led the bank to change its lending policy on largest borrowers. Prior to 91, he served as a senior country economist in the Middle East and North Africa region, working on Jordan, Syria, Tunisia, and Egypt. He received a BA in economics, a BS in mathematics from the State University of New York, an MA in economics, an MS in industrial engineering, and a PhD in economics from the University of Pittsburgh. He joined the World Bank Group through its Young Professionals program. Can we have Mr. Hindin come on stage? The order for tonight's event is as follows. The keynote speech will be followed by Mr. Hindin's presentation, and then there will be an interactive session between the panelists, which Alexis will moderate, and then a Q&A session. I will then return to deliver closing remarks, which will be followed by drinks receptions upstairs in the foyer. We have only 3 requests of our audience. Firstly, that all mobile devices be, at the very least, placed on silent. And second, that you please respect our rule that the Q&A session are to be free and open with no fear of abuse or heckling or kissing teeth. Nothing can be deemed taboo or heretical in our discussion. Let us talk freely about attitudes, culture, race, gender, or tribe, and better yet, about ideas. And third, the only names permitted to give speeches tonight are Dr. Yumkela, Mr. Din, Mr. Flynn. Please keep your comments or questions brief, so all that seek to participate can have a turn. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that comprehensive introduction. I'd just like to echo the introduction and really say how fantastic an opportunity this is, really to hear 2 of the foremost minds on Africa. Dr. Yumkela, who has recently received a global leadership award along with Bishop Desmond Tutu, is truly one of the continent's finest sons, and I think, Mr. Hindon is, again, I think, somebody who really provides the kind of granular detail and analysis on Africa that takes us beyond the platitudes that we often hear about the continent. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk about how Africa is an emerging continent. I mean, The Economist recently went back on its rather disdainful proclamation of 10 years ago that it was the hopeless continent, and then suddenly woke up to the fact that it was the hopeful continent. We hear a lot of we hear a lot of this talk, we hear a lot of statistics, but actually we need people like Mr. Hindon to provide us with the detail and the explanations of why that actually is the case. So I think thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here tonight, and I look forward to as speaking on behalf of the audience, to hearing what you have to say. Just a brief note. I think you know, as I said, you know, Africa is obviously the investor darling at the moment, but why that is, any number of reasons, depends on the perspective that you take. I think the facts speak for themselves. I mean, 5% growth estimated by the IMF this year. It's really very much you can't find a starker contrast with the rest of the world. However, within that, I think that there's also a series of fundamental challenges. As much as Africa provides it has a cocktail, a recipe, if you like, of success, a young emerging population, rapidly urbanizing, certainly a technologically adaptable and from a consumer point of view, very interesting. I think the inescapable reality of African life, and as Africans we all appreciate this, is inequality and wealth disparity, and that is a key critical issue that we need to address. There are a lot of people who are unemployed, there are a lot of people who live with very meager resources, truly a testament to their ability to thrive in arduous situations, but that can't really be sustained beyond the foreseeable future. So how do we address those issues? So without further ado, I'll stop blathering and hand over to Dr. Yumkela. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thank the organizers for inviting me to join your debate. I don't come here with major prescriptions for you, but rather to challenge this young audience to be more ambitious for Africa. Let me say that about 5 years ago, I was invited to a similar event at Warwick by the Economics Association. It was a full room, maybe 300 or more students. And that day, a CEO of a major bank in the UK was the keynote speaker, and two of us were supposed to react after his speech. And he did this wonderful presentation about what the global economy will look like in the next 10 to 15 years. And in all his presentation, he did not mention Africa. And of course, when he finished in the question and answer period, one of the students said, "But you didn't say anything about Africa," and he was frank. He said, "Actually, yes, it will not affect these trends." And he gave three numbers. One was manufacturing, not very significant, less than 2% of global manufacturing value added. FDI, minuscule. Capital markets, non-existent, except for South Africa. So, I'm sorry, but yes, that's why I didn't include it in the analysis. Whatever happens, there may be security issues, but in terms of economic trends, Africa will not impact it. And you can imagine the effect on the young Africans in the audience, but it was reality. Reality. You know our past, the 1980s and 1990s, they say the lost decades of Africa, but we've done reasonably well the last 10, maybe 12 years. Some of the numbers are there, good performance for a number of economies. As he mentioned now, 5% average growth rate. Some economies say 7 out of 10 fast-growing economies, meaning 7% and above GDP growth rates from 2001 to 2010. 7 of them were Africa, of the 10. The IMF has also projected now 2011 to 2015, 7 of the 10 include African countries. We've done reasonably well. And of course, there's a boom, a commodity boom, and everybody's making a deal with Africa. In the last 5 years, I have been to a number of those partnership conferences, EU-Africa partnership, Africa-Brazil, Africa-China, Africa-India, you name it. I've been to many of them. But for one thing, underneath all of that, commodities. Everybody needs a piece of that real estate. Yes, we're sitting on significant mineral deposits, in some cases 30%, 40%, 60%, depending on the particular kind of minerals. We are also sitting on 60% of the uncultivated arable land. All of that is good news, but let's look deeper at the numbers. Some colleagues of mine published a report, it's a book actually, that we edited on agribusiness, and we were looking deeper into some of these numbers to say, well, good news, but let's look at it within the context of agribusiness and analyze it further. And we used a typology that Jim Wolferson, the former president of the World Bank, had used. In 2007, Wolferson described a four-speed world, four categories of countries: the affluent, the OECD countries, the converging, the struggling, and the poor. The converging nations are those that are closing the gap with the affluent OECD countries, while the struggling nations are those that fail to progress from the middle income status. So sometimes we talk about the middle income trap like in Latin America. The poor countries, most of them in Africa, were mired in extreme poverty. Based on this classification, the number of extreme poor African countries had fallen from 35 to 21 in the 1990s. Not too bad. The number of developed converging countries had increased from 2 to 17. But here's the footnote. 12 of the convergers are oil exporting or mineral exporting countries. 3 of them, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, have achieved convergence through agricultural development, and the last 2, Mauritius and Cape Verde, are not resource-based. So the bulk of those that were converging was based on the commodity boom. We have also done well, generally, as I mentioned, 5% GDP growth rate on average. However, the reality is that in 2005, sub-Saharan Africa was the world's poorest region, with just over 50% of its population still living on less than $1.25 a day. This is almost like the way it was 25 years ago. In fact, the income gap between Africa and other developing regions has been widening over the past 40 years. We did well, but not as good as others. Growth in most of other regions is driven by manufacturing, whereas in Africa, the growth has been driven by commodity exports. But I think my colleague will talk a little bit more based on collaborative work our organization is doing with the World Bank, looking at what manufacturing did, labor-intensive manufacturing did for Asian economies, including China, and the potential for Africa to do the same rather than rely on commodities alone. But let me tell you why I believe it is very urgent that African nations become very ambitious, very aggressive in pursuing structural change and industrialization in today's context. I'll give you 3 reasons. The first one is there are a lot of writings in the last year and a half, one of them by Jeremy Rifkin at Wharton University, that there is a new industrial revolution taking place. Jeremy says it's a 3rd industrial revolution. Others have said, okay, it's an industrial revolution, maybe not 3rd. They are not putting a number. But recently, a number of articles have come out indicating that there is an industrial revolution. In Jeremy's view, this 3rd industrial revolution will be based on new energy sources. He shows how in the first, and in his words, the 2nd industrial revolution, you see a convergence between energy systems and information systems. And he believes the 3rd industrial revolution will be driven by clean, decentralized energy sources and their intersection with the digital revolution that is taking place. Now, you may not believe that there is an industrial revolution, but I encourage you to look at what Germany is doing, what Korea is doing, and Denmark and Japan. They're driving heavily green growth. Korea has decided to invest 2% of their GDP in green growth, projecting growth 20, 25 years from now, and the technologies that will lead it, and why they will be leaders in those technologies. The new Prime Minister of Denmark doing the same. Germany, same push for new energy systems and green growth, green jobs. But also, the European Union has in fact adopted the pillars proposed by Jeremy Rifkin for the 3rd industrial revolution as part of their EU strategy for pushing industrialization, particularly green growth within the EU. It's happening, and I can give you numbers for China as well, since I serve also on the China Council. I serve on a council chaired by the Vice Premier of China, also on green growth and having a harmonized society projected 20, 30 years from now. Second, climate change. Climate change is real. If you look at all the projections, business as usual, if business as usual continues, we may lose 50% of our crop yields in Africa. Now, let me tell you why that is serious. We project already in the UN, FAO, WFP, IFAD, and others, that we need to increase food production by 50% globally by 2030, 70% by 2050, because our population indeed will be 8 billion and 9 billion going forward. Now, just Africa, our UN statistics, we project the African population will be about 1.3 billion by 2030, about 2.2 billion by 2050. We have one of the fastest urbanization rates. Average age in the urban communities, about 18 years and less. So think about it. Rapid population growth, massive urbanization, lower food production. That's a recipe for disaster. Third, there is discovery of natural resources every year in Africa, major finds. Give you the case of my country, Sierra Leone. We just recovered 8 years ago from a devastating war. Just 5 years ago, we started announcing huge finds in iron ore, one of the 15 largest deposits. We've just discovered oil and gas as well. Just a few months ago, there was an announcement for Mozambique. They may have as much natural gas, perhaps as Kuwait, Tanzania also. Ghana just started exporting oil. Mauritania, same. But again, if you look at the US Geological Survey, you'll see the numbers in terms of mineral discoveries and deposits in our region. For me, this gives us perhaps an opportunity to jumpstart industrial transformation in our countries. Now, to do that, we need to take a number of actions. And I believe we should learn from what the Asians have done, and I'll just give you maybe 8 lessons to encourage your debate going forward. You've heard a lot about good governance. It is still crucial. Leadership matters. In a number of those economies that have been able to achieve this structural change that Dean will be describing in detail, especially in light manufacturing, these have been deliberate strategies. Market-oriented, but deliberate. Deliberate public-private partnerships to promote that move to new productive sectors away from commodities, to help companies improve products so that they can gain market access in various markets. Deliberate strategies, good leadership, but again, everything you've heard about good governance is crucial. But I add something here, which is linked to natural resource management. We must aggressively pursue the extractive industries transparency initiative and also the natural resource charter, which are all instruments that have been launched in the last 7 years about how we can manage natural resources to invest properly in new sectors, new productive sectors, but also invest for the future generations to come. From Norway to Botswana, you see many of those examples. So good governance in its totality, democracy and so on, but I emphasize the need for looking at how we manage natural resources. Second, lowering the cost of doing business. If you look at the World Bank statistics on lowering the cost of doing business, a number of African countries are doing well, but we have to be even more aggressive. It still takes a long time to establish a business in a number of African countries. When I worked in Nigeria, 2000 to 2003, we used to look at the same numbers together with the World Bank there, and we were looking at the manufacturing sector. Sometimes it took some companies 3 to 4 weeks to clear their goods from the ports. By the time they cleared it, the competitor in Asia has already received, produced, and is shipping out already to markets. That was when the local industry was beginning to get their goods out of the ports. So cost of doing business and the transactions costs involved need to go down even faster if, in fact, we're going to have industrial competitiveness. Infrastructure. One cannot overemphasize the need for investing in infrastructure, roads, bridges, port facilities, and of course, my favorite is energy. We have today 580 million, based on the statistics of the International Energy Agency, 580 million Africans without electricity. We're the most energy poor region. We estimate with the World Bank that Africa loses 2 to 3% of its GDP because of lack of energy or unreliable energy. Again, my favorite statistic is always Nigeria. I hope the Nigerians don't get offended here. I live there, I work there. I do worse when I'm at home with my Nigerian brothers and sisters, because they just reached, I was just there 6 weeks ago again in another energy forum with the presidency. They just reached 4,500 megawatts. They need 10,000 megawatts. They just reached now 4,500 megawatts. 2 days ago, EBRD, we just organized a conference in EBRD looking at gas flaring reduction around the world. And of course, we're looking at West Africa and Nigeria. Nigeria has been burning gas for over 40 years. We estimate already, Statoil and a number of oil companies, that the gas flared in Africa can supply about 50% of Africa's electricity, but we burn it. No value addition. We don't even use it for generating power. Human capital. We have to go beyond just education. We know today a number of the educated kids cannot be hired in factories. In Africa, that's part of what I do. We walk into factories. We do a lot of analysis at the factory level of skills, knowledge. We have to develop skills. People say, yes, Africa's labor is cheap, but it's unskilled. And what worries us is this massive urbanization and youthful population. Nigeria, the estimate is that Nigeria will be about 300 million in 20, 25 years, but 30, 40 million of those in Lagos. Just think about it. Lack of infrastructure, packed there, no jobs. That's going to be a crisis, but it's similar numbers. Sierra Leone, our population will also double around the same period. And everybody's heading into Freetown. We're much smaller. Freetown was built for 250,000 people. Now we're already at 2 million. So just think about, again, uneducated, unskilled youth, whether in fact there will be jobs for them and whether in fact they will become productive citizens. In Asia, when we look at similar numbers in Vietnam, India, they will tell you, and they look at the demographic transitions, they tell you that's their competitive advantage in the future because they're skilled and they're investing heavily in education so that they will become even more so the factory of the world. And so they look at the demographic numbers and the youthful population as a demographic dividend. For us, if they're not educated, it will be a crisis. Institutional reforms. Of course, governments change, and in Africa, typically when governments change, policies change too. People don't have continuity. For industrial transformation, you need stable, predictable policies over time. Same for energy, same for infrastructure. In fact, in recent discussions we're having now with oil companies to look at gas markets or power generating companies, they tell you always they need TLC in public policy. Transparency of the policy, longevity of the policy, credibility of the policy. Because it takes time to make money in manufacturing. It's not 2, 3 years, sometimes 7. In energy sector, probably after 10. Companies need assurance that in fact these policies will be stable and will be there. And therefore you need institutions that will guarantee those. Both democratic institutions, but key institutions that will make the cost of doing business go down, but also guarantee that investments will be protected. My last 2 points are the following. Trade is important. We're not talking about the old debate about whether you should focus more on exports or domestic markets. You need to do both. In fact, trade matters a whole lot. That's what the Asians did. In our case, we've looked at purchasing power in African countries. There is no way we can manufacture and have that demand locally. But also exports make you look at competition. So trade has to be part of that equation. I know when I go to some of these debates in political science, environments, they take us back to the 60s debate about export-led growth and looking at domestic markets. We need both. And in fact, also we need to push inter-regional trade. Last point, we must be ready to learn from others. And you'll see some of the work that will be presented, Justin and others. They've looked at how China learned from what Japan and others did. Korea learned from what others did. Justin did some presentations for us. Recently, I had him in Vienna for about 4 weeks. Justin Lin is the former chief economist of the World Bank, looking at what he called the flying geese model and the learning by doing that other economies were able to do. My last comment will be a quotation that I'll just take from the work done by Michael Spence and others in their growth and competitiveness report in 2008. They looked at 13 countries that had been growing at 7% and above. 7% and above for about 25 years, the best performing economies, growing at 7% and above. And they were looking for what was common amongst them. Amongst the issues they raised, one of them was the following: leadership and effective governance characterized by stable and predictable public policy, consisting of policy formulation, implementation over a long time. Investors want to know that the rules of the game, what the rules of the game are. They want assurances that the rules are fair and applicable to all, and that the policies will be stable and predictable for 10 or 20 years. Because we're talking about long-term development, not short-term growth. Number two, the willingness to experiment. Governments have to be entrepreneurial. They try some policies, it does not work, they adjust. Yes, in the old days when we tried import substitution, industrialization, we didn't change. Even when the policies were not working, the protectionist barriers were still high, we didn't adjust. So experimentation and learning from others, they believe was a key issue. But growth over 20 years at 7%, to do that requires some deliberate action by governments. Today we call it public-private partnerships. It never occurred by accident, even in the best performing economies. They were market-oriented, yes, but governments also assisted, companies and others. Governments did not necessarily go into production, but there were smart partnerships. It is the same thing we see today as we're discussing green growth and new industrial sectors that will be sustainable. The role of government to create those markets and incentives is crucial, and it will be the same for Africa. In conclusion, you are the next generation of Africans. I think what the results of the last 11, 12 years have shown is we can do it. We can do it. The governments have tried. We see a lot of democracy in Africa today compared to 80s and 90s. Not enough. We still see instability, but I can tell you that if the demographic numbers continue, if we continue to rely only on commodities, what happened in the MENA region will be worse down south. It'll be worse down south. Just think about it. Lagos, Addis, Freetown, Abidjan. Unemployed millions of youth, lack of infrastructure, lack of water supply, insufficient food, lack of jobs. There will be a disaster. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a great honor for me to be here. And tonight I'm going to present to you very quickly some findings of the recent book that we just published. It's called Lime Manufacturing in Africa. And it's done jointly with several organizations, one of which is UNIDO, the Dr. Jim Keller just mentioned. I will first talk about some of our findings, and then what are the challenges to industrialization in Africa, what are some of the possible solutions, especially the one that we find in Asian countries, including the possible role of the government. The book that you see here today, in fact, I brought a few copies. The book that you see here today is our first project done at the bank under the new structural economics pioneered by Justin Lin, the Dr. Jim Keller just mentioned. And it focuses on policy which facilitate the growth of manufacturing. The background of the book, can I have the first slide, please? The background of the book is that Africa has done quite well in the last decade. As you could see, Africa's GDP grew by 5.2% in the last, between 2001 and 2010. That means a per capita income growth of about 2% per annum. And that's compared to the previous decade of minus 0.4%. So it has been a great turnaround. what we are finding is that this growth has been based mostly on commodity exports, as Dr. Yamkala has mentioned, because of the high international commodity prices in the last few years. In reality, Africa investment remains very low. It's less than 15% of GDP. And 80% of African workers are still working in low productivity jobs. In the meanwhile, manufacturing has declined to less than 1% of the global output. So the recent economic growth is really not sustainable unless it is accompanied by structural transformation, by the kind of jobs that Africa needs, in particular the young people, the young African generations could aspire to. Yet we know that simple labor-intensive manufacturing jobs has been available for many Asian countries. And this is the right time for Africa to embark on light manufacturing because the cost of labor is rapidly rising in China. In particular, it started from the coastal provinces in China, and now it's gone into throughout the country. So this represents a very unique, very excellent opportunity for Africa to go with manufacturing. The next slide, please. What we did in this study is we looked at manufacturing in 5 countries, 3 of them in Africa, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Zambia. We use China as a benchmark and Vietnam as a comparator. And the reason why we use China as a benchmark because even though the conditions in China today are much different than Africa, if you think back 30 years ago, China is not much different from Africa today. It's a benchmark because if you go into light manufacturing, inevitably you have to compare yourself with China because it's the largest producer of manufacturing goods. But the size of the country, China with 1.4 billion people, is really not a strict comparator to many of the African, in fact, for all Africa. So we picked Vietnam as more of a comparator because of a smaller size, 80, 90 million people, comparable to Ethiopia. And the 5 sectors that we were looking at is apparel, leather products, wood products, metal products, and agribusiness. All of these sectors are labor-intensive sectors, could generate a lot of employment for Africa. Next slide, please. I will not bother you with the approach, with the quantitative and qualitative approach here, but just to tell you very briefly, we did our work first based on the enterprise survey, which covers some 10,000 data points from the enterprise survey of the bank. We also conducted qualitative survey of about 300 enterprises in the 5 countries. And my team just went to various enterprises. We went to talk to government officials. We went to talk to private sector, business organization. We conducted the qualitative survey that was designed by Professor Sutton at London School of Economics. We also conducted something called quantitative survey based on roughly 1,200 enterprises in all 5 countries. And that is to verify the work that we done in terms of interview. The quantitative surveys are designed by Oxford, by a group of professors at Oxford, led by Marcel Fabjames of Center for African Studies at Oxford University. We also hired a company, a private company, that did the comparative value chain analysis. And later on, I will show you some of the work that we did. In the value chain analysis, this company, a company called GDS, Global Development Solutions, based in Reston in Virginia, they carry out the detailed analysis It's called value chain analysis of the 5 countries. For example, in the case of apparel, they took a polo shirt, and they break down the cost of polo shirt from the cost of importing fabric down to the cost of importing buttons, down to the truck that takes the fabric from the port to the factory. What is the cost for the accountant in the factory to produce the report at the end of the month? All of these costs are taken into account and did a careful comparison, country by country, factory by factory, product by product. The final study is a Kaizen study, and that is done by the group of Japanese researchers on 4 countries. Okay, so here you see that the team visited the Chinese enterprise as part of the qualitative survey, the second one. Next slide, please. What are the main findings? Our main finding is that first, Africa does have the potential to create millions of productive jobs, okay? And that is because, in part, the labor cost advantage is rising for Africa in light of the rising labor costs in China. Africa also benefited from natural resource advantage. And for example, in terms of leather products, you have excellent leather coming from large herd of cattle. You also have privileged access to high-income markets. Africa has AGOA, which is an agreement with North America, with the US, and you have the Cotonou Agreement for the EU. And then you also have a growing domestic and regional market. However, the structure of the industry in Africa right now, not just in 3 countries that we survey, but I've worked a lot on many other African countries, and we found basically the same thing. And that is, you have a very few large enterprises that are formal, mostly SOE, state-owned enterprises, or foreign-owned enterprises. And then you have a vast majority, vast number of firms, very small, very informal, and engaging in very low productivity work. So if you talk about improving productivity, you have to think of both types of enterprises. Next slide, please. So we found that at the broad level, there are 6 major constraints for light manufacturing. The first one is input cost and quality. The second one is industrial land. The third one is finance, trade logistics, entrepreneurial, and the worker skills. And the constraints vary by subsector and by firm size. Now, this has 2 implications. The first is that policymakers need to first do the work to find out what are the specific constraints in the subsector in order to design policies to remove them. Second, once they identify the constraints, they will find out that these constraints are limited in number and that can easily be addressed, which can lead to reform momentum, which can lead to further reforms. So our finding, in effect, is different, is in contrast to previous studies, which shows that Africa is facing a long list of constraints, including infrastructure, education, corruption, red tape, everything under the sun has been found to exist in Africa. Our findings show that there's a much smaller subset of specific and sometimes new set of constraints for each of the subsector, okay? And this means that if you narrow the analysis to the few subsectors that you want to address, the reform agenda becomes much more manageable. And it would be within the financial and human resources of Africa. Here we show you through this matrix, how we did the work in Ethiopia, that if you see the matrix here, it looks a lot, but if you look at the key one, which is the critical one, the number of constraints becomes much more manageable. We won't have time to go into detail on all of this, but let me take the case of the leather product, in particular for Ethiopia, because this is very representative of the rest of the issues in Africa. The leather industry in Ethiopia employs 8,000 workers and 8 million of exports. Right? If you compare this to the leather industry in Vietnam, it has 600,000 workers, and it exports about $3 billion each year. Now, we know that Ethiopia labor cost is cheaper, is lower than Vietnam. In fact, the average wage in Ethiopia in the leather sector is about half of the wage in Vietnam, and about a fifth of the wage in China. Ethiopia also has the second largest cattle, herd of cattle in Africa, next to Sudan. Okay. Yet our finding shows that the key issue for the leather sector is a shortage of quality processed leather because of the poor disease control, because of lack of quality processing of rawhide, and the trade policy on processed leather. In terms of solution, the solution involves treating of the parasite that affect the skin of the animal, and that's called ectoparasite. A study by USAID found that with a modest cost, with roughly about $9.5 million a year, the problem, the incidence of ectoparasite could be reduced from 94% down to 5% of the cattle. So the cost of $9.5 million is really insignificant compared to the benefits of export in terms of the leather products, either leather products or shoes. The second solution that we found was that the technical assistance in terms of treatment of the hide. And there, Ethiopia started asking the India Footwear Design Association to provide technical assistance to 7 factories. And what happened is one of them, the Ramsey factory, was able to produce and export leather shoes to Italy. And they compete very well in the Italian market. Imagine that. I mean, Ethiopia leather shoes been sold in the Italian market in the same fashion as Italian shoes. So some of the policy measures that are found require changing of the existing policy. Others require the provision of the public goods that could be very inexpensive. What are the policy implications of our findings? Because the binding constraints vary by country and by subsector, the policymakers need to identify, prioritize, and remove the most serious constraint. They need to target the policy selectively in line with the comparative advantage and capability of the country. They need to use a range of policy, and they need to start small. Remembering that success breeding success. They need to develop specific and finite set of initiatives, partnering with private sector, as mentioned before. They need to start small. They need to scale up success and terminating failure. More importantly, this process should start now because the competition is heating up and other countries, I could mention 2, Bangladesh, Cambodia, are standing in and ready to step in. So Africa cannot afford to miss another opportunity now. Let me quickly go over the lessons that we learned from Asian countries in the process of preparing this book. First of all, industrialization can happen over a very short period of time. If you think back, it took the West, it took Britain, it took US, it took Europe hundreds of years to industrialize. But if you look at China 30 years ago, China is not different from Africa today. And in the course of 30 years, with the help of globalization, with the help of the rapid transfer of knowledge and technology, many of the Asian countries are able to achieve what they have today. Second, there's a need to focus on practical solutions instead of dogmatic or ideological solutions. Second best policy work. And this is a bit different from what, as you know, what the laissez-faire economics usually prescribe. The solutions that Asians find, the industrial park, the clusters, are all second best approach. And they're not really sticking to any ideology. Whatever works, they adopt. I think that is key to their success. Even this targeted approach that we are proposing is part of the second best, because we should not wait until all the problems of electricity, all the problems of governance, all the problems of water to disappear before you start working on industrialization. Right? It has to start now. Third, neither the private sector nor the public sector can drive the process. Success requires seamless cooperation between the two sectors. And furthermore, realigned incentives between the government and the private sector. About 30 years ago, in China, the government officials get rewarded on the basis of their following the party line, they're on the basis of their propaganda. Then they changed the strategy that officials, especially local officials, only get promoted, get rewarded on the basis of the GDP growth of their province, of their local areas. And that created a tremendous surge in economic activities, because everybody is for himself or herself. And knowing that their career depends on what happens on the ground, it really makes a big difference. We also find that logistics is important. The small private sector initiatives should go first in terms of location to be expanded with the help of the government. And this is where I think this is different. What we are recommending is completely different from the economics back in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s or 70s, the intervention of the government was based on import substitution, was based on protective policies, especially protective tariff, that no longer exist. In fact, these policies led to bankruptcies for many African countries. We then led them to swing the pendulum in terms of economic policies. In the 80s, they went on the way to market forces and let the market forces determine everything. That, of course, did not result in industrialization, as you know by now. Okay? So the cooperation in Asian countries, first of all, the government let the private sector go first in terms of location, in terms of developing what they call national clusters. Only at the later stage that the government intervened to help the expansion. The other conclusion that we reached was that light manufacturing can flourish even when workers don't have a formal education. Again, this is consistent with what we mentioned earlier, that you don't need to wait until everybody is educated in order to start working on light manufacturing. Finally, and this is the point that I think is very relevant to you as the diaspora or the African community abroad, that the Asian countries fully exploit both FDI and what I call FKI, which is a foreign knowledge or know-how and ideas. Okay? It's no accident that when China started its industrialization process, it's set up in 1979 4 special economic zones. And they all located in Guangdong and Fujian. Why? And these two provinces are not most advanced in terms of infrastructure. They're not most advanced in terms of facilities, and they're not advanced in terms of getting the direct foreign investment at that time. The reason why they located these 4 industrial zones was to aim at the overseas Chinese. And this is a factor that is not really, has not been emphasized in the literature. Okay? The overseas Chinese from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and from all of the foreign community in foreign countries abroad have contributed a lot to the rapid growth of the Chinese industrialization in the past 3 decades. Finally, let me say a few words on the government role. Again, I mentioned that before. The government role need not be in the forms of subsidies or active intervention of the government. Sometimes, even a statement coming from the top leader of the strong commitment to promote industrial development goes a long way to helping. And this is the case in China. After the Tiananmen Square event, the industrialization in China started to slow down until the leader, Deng Xiaoping at that time, visited the south, Guangdong. And in 1992, he made a statement that China should continue on the pushing forward with the modernization effort. And he uses the term, as by now you all know, that it doesn't matter whether you are whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mouse, right? And since then, just a statement from the leader provides reassurance throughout China, and the modernization effort then continue. The second point on government role is to understand the constraints of key sectors, and we believe that the focus should be on labor-intensive and final consumer goods first before they go upstream. The need to maintain a macroeconomic stability is very key. And again, facilitate the role of the foreign know-how, the technology and idea is also key. Finally, I think there's, of course, we can always talk about the Chinese lesson, the Asian lessons, but the situation in each country varies. So when you apply the lessons from Asians and from Chinese to Africa, especially given the diverse conditions of African countries, the first speaker mentioned that there are 48 countries with different conditions. So we need to be careful in applying the lessons, and we need to be thinking about the specific subsector in talking about mobilizing the support of the government and of the community for industrialization in Africa. Thank you very much.
Wonderfully informative presentations. I think we covered a great deal of material. There's so many different themes and points to address, and I'm sure the audience is gagging to provide some provocative questioning of their own. I think I'd like to kick off the process and address the question to both speakers, and that really is, it's on I think, again, you highlighted all the challenges that need to be overcome. I mean, we could debate, I'm sure, into the early hours what order we need to address those particular challenges. Whether some might, by addressing certain challenges first, we might be able to overcome others in shorter order. But I think the one that really stands out is access to capital and cost of capital for small manufacturers in Africa. And again, you can contrast this perhaps with the Asian experience, where a lot of Asian companies, the current account position is very different to the one that a lot of African countries find themselves in today, which gave them an advantage. Also, I think the role of the state in providing that capital. We've just seen in recent weeks really interesting news that Angola and Nigeria have unveiled multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth funds that they intend to use the proceeds of that commodity wealth that you mentioned to benefit their nations. It remains to be seen what they're investing. And I would like to throw this question over to you. How is it possible to overcome that particular constraint, that access to capital? Is there a role, would you like to see these sovereign wealth funds, commodity producers set aside that wealth and then look to create the kind of state funding or perhaps export credit agencies? Perhaps it could be done on a regional level. We've seen very good examples in Ethiopia and Kenya with the Eastern Energy Highway project, where you've got the regional cooperation, you've got the funding from African institutions. Is that the way forward? And yeah, I think that if you could address some of those themes, it would be very interesting.
I think for the countries that have a commodity boom, for me it is very obvious that you don't only need the sovereign wealth funds, you also need national development banks. National development banks that will have a clear private sector window to support small and medium enterprise development, that will provide long-term capital. In a number of African countries today, you have interest rates at 27%, 28%. Nobody will borrow at that level to go into manufacturing. They will borrow to bring in container loads of goods, turn it around quickly within 3 months, pay back, but not long-term manufacturing or agribusiness for that matter. And we see it in Nigeria, we see it in other places, Sierra Leone and so on. So you do need them to establish national development banks with some of those funds targeting small and medium enterprises that want to go into production. Around 2001, 2002, I took some African ministers to Malaysia, to the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Authority. They were surprised to see that they still had banks in Malaysia that were giving official loans, 3%, because they were trying to promote diversification in certain sectors. But it was not just cash. They also had the Ministry of Science and Technology providing technology support. So, and there were conditions. You don't just get the cash, you also have to go through due diligence to qualify. And what he said, they never compromised on performance. There were clear performance indicators before you get the next tranche. So there are some lessons. A small and medium enterprise development authority, long-term financing, whether it's for manufacturing or agribusiness, will be crucial. Today, a number of the commercial banks rather finance trade, not agribusiness or manufacturing. Very difficult, still in Africa.
Yeah, in my previous work on Africa, I also found out, and I agree completely with Dr. Jimtalo, in the sense that banking sector in Africa is mostly rely on the deposit which is deposit rate, which is quite high, and then lend out to trading sector and make a profit. It's very easy. But we have to understand, I think, why is the best efforts at subsidizing loans in Africa have failed. In our work in Asian countries, we find out that virtually all the enterprises that we interview, when they first started out, they rely on their own savings or friends' savings or family savings. And that's the case both in Africa and in Asia. Why? That's because no banks would lend to you if you have no record, if you're not credit good, if you haven't shown that you've done anything, it's very risky, right? So the way I think the way we're going forward is, in the case of Asia, what they did is, at the initial stage, when you start out on your own. After 2 or 3 years, after you have established record, then the state come in, and they help to expand. And that's why the expansion phase is very, very key, and that needed the help of the financial sector, in particular of the development bank, like Dr. Jimtalo said. But otherwise, if you just start lending out to the private sector at the beginning stage, it's very risky. And that, I mean, that has been shown by history.
I think another, question is around how the role that the state potentially can play in encouraging the participation of small to medium-sized enterprises, and I think medium-sized players too, depending on the industry that we're talking about, within certain sectors like, for example, energy or commodity resource extraction. Perhaps there could be more of a role for a local supply chain, rather than these guys bringing in contractors from outside. They should be looking to use a local element. I mean, do you think that, and to maybe extend that to, say, to foreign retailers that come in to a country, or any foreign investor really, should there be a local procurement element to their investment? That again, this is something perhaps for legislators to address, but that would be in contravention of most WTO principles. I know when Walmart bought into Massmart in South Africa recently, they encountered exactly this kind of issue. But again, I mean, perhaps we need to think a little bit outside of the box in terms of a classic laissez-faire economic approach. What would you respond to that suggestion?
A number of governments are looking at local content requirements. I know it's very controversial with WTO, but I think a few governments are pursuing that a little bit more rigorously now. For example, in mining, a number of mining companies will bring chickens from overseas to feed their workers, import rice as well, because why? They need it quickly. That is understandable in their startup phase, but I believe today in Africa there should be some requirement, deliberate public policy, that for some of these commodities you must also reach out to the community to have local supplies. Of course, it's not for free, but you create a market. And this is where the development bank financing becomes useful. There is a market, you know, there will be contracts on the mining companies that can be supported for entrepreneurs who want to go into that respect, into that kind of a business. I can also say that for a few African countries I know now, they are also copying what other Asian countries are doing, even for green growth. They're making sure that they also introduce some elements of local content requirement for technologies that will support solar energy or wind energy to create a local supply chain. And you need some of those to happen. So local content is crucial. In the oil industry, we're looking at some numbers now in Africa, the oil industry. There is a country that gives out contracts almost $3 billion for various services for that sector. People get a contract, they go in and fly in workers from elsewhere. People can be trained locally. So again, these are areas where government can be a little bit more proactive, to have some discipline in the market, and encourage skills development locally. That way you integrate, you get more linkages in the broader economy.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult for African countries to deal with the Dutch disease coming from the mineral resources sector. Because if you think about it, the resource-based industries like oil, like gas, they all, even our commodities like a copper, they're all based on the very capital-intensive technology. How many workers are needed actually to run an oil production unit? Very little, right? Very few, right? Or copper, right? A copper mine could operate on the basis of 200 workers. So you don't need many workers. So if you look at the employment creation aspects of the mineral-based resource countries, you find that somehow we have to go beyond of what what these industries could provide, and go into, again, I mean, I'm not advertising too much for lime manufacturing, but agriculture is certainly one way, and then lime manufacturing is another way to really create employment. And in a way, I must say that Asian countries are lucky in the sense that they did not have that much of natural resources. If they did as much as Nigeria did, or many of, or Zambia had, I'm not sure they could be where they are today, because in many ways, the issue of how to deal effectively with natural resources is a very difficult. It's extremely difficult because on the one hand, you want to use those resources for the development of the country, right? Especially when these resources are exhausted. I mean, 30 years, 40 years from today, when the younger generation came, the natural resources exhausted, what you going to do, right? On the other hand, the fact that you have a lot of income coming in, like Nigeria, is people, especially the inhabitants, the population tend to have a very high expectation of the government. Right? I mean, they would, the newspaper is about with all these stories. I mean, with all the income coming in from oil, why is it that we have no hospital, and why is it that we have no road? So I would say that it's best in a way if we could isolate the natural resources sector away from the economy, let the labor market, for example, be determined entirely on the demand and supply for labor, rather than on the basis of artificial wages created by the natural resources sector. I say that because I work on Zambia a lot, and in Zambia, you have the case that it's based on copper, right? In the 60s or 70s, you have a copper sector that can generate a sector by and of itself, and then it draws resources from other sectors. You have people moving from the rural areas to Lusaka. 55% of Zambian population is in Lusaka. You have a hospital, you have school that are equivalent to any of the best institutions in the world, and yet the rest of Africa, the rest of Zambia is struggling. And so, again, this is a very difficult issue.
Great, thank you. I think some very provocative ideas, and this is just what we need to stir the debate. So I think I'll throw the questions open to the floor. I should just add that Dr. Yumkela has very generously given us his time tonight, but he's on quite a tight schedule. So if you could keep your questions quite brief, and please introduce yourself too when you ask the question. It would be nice to know who you are. We'll take one in the front here, please. Thank you.
My name is Ayo, and I run a product development consultancy in London. I'm just curious, during your research, were you able to find businesses using digital platforms, digital technology, as to underline business models that actually allow them to distribute products and services that are internationally competitive?
In the work we have done in UNIDO, we have seen only a handful of companies, those that have an international partner, for example, using digital technology the way you were describing it. In some others, because of fluctuation of energy, some even stay stuck to old technology. I give you an example of some food companies that we've surveyed. Because they rely on the national grid, they refuse to automate and use computer systems. Because each time the power goes out, they have to recalibrate or dump the food. Because everything is calibrated very carefully, and it can only be exposed for X number of seconds. The power goes out, you're waiting for the standby generator to come on. Some even chose to get off the national grid. But we also noticed that they were making deliberate decisions not to improve technology because of lack of power. So again, limiting their use of new technology, in this case, computerization of their production systems. But those with foreign partnerships, a lot of them would use such methodologies.
Thank you. We'll take one over here, the gentleman with the blue tie. But just ask you also if you could address your question to which particular speaker or both speakers.
My name is Miles Mujiti, and my company publishes a website and newsletters focusing on the development of the pharmaceutical industry in Africa, in which obviously UNIDO has done a lot of work, and you are currently, of course, working on the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. You're working on a business plan with the African Union Commission. What I wanted to ask you, Dr. Yumkela, is since you joined UNIDO, how has the debate evolved between industrial development and public health? And as UNIDO, how have you handled that issue when you approach stakeholders on the development of a manufacturing industry? And perhaps moving into an issue that Mr. Dean touched on relating to competitive advantage. There have been sort of issues that have been raised that perhaps we could be better off focusing on leveraging our strong biodiversity to focus on research and development rather than to try to jump onto pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Of course, for about 15 years now, the discussion has been providing access to medication. So donations, distribution systems, as long as people can gain access. And so a lot of focus from many countries has been on ways in which they can source anywhere to make it cheaply available. What we've seen happening in the last 3 years is a renewed debate now whether in fact domestic manufacturing can enhance access and at the same time create jobs and so on. So the co-benefits. And so the AU is just coming into that debate now. That's why we're helping them with this pharmaceutical production master plan, which we will launch in January. But yes, the debate is shifting back a little bit to see how can we create a production base. Why? Because they've seen the case of Thailand. Because of domestic production for HIV/AIDS cocktails, they have seen that access to HIV/AIDS cocktails really spread very fast. And these are not big, sophisticated manufacturing systems. Some of them are small scale or medium scale. So these cases are being looked at now, whether Africa, in fact, can piggyback on that decentralized production and domestic production of pharmaceuticals. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry will face the same thing as any manufacturing industry. Some of what both of us have mentioned, the cost of doing business, whether they will be cost competitive compared to those imported, and so on and so forth. So, but there is a shift now. There's a great focus. We've received the same feedback from the UNAIDS coordination group, WHO, and this is why the three of us, UNAIDS, WHO, and ourselves, will be doing this work with the AU, but also to look at best practices. We know, for example, that about 75% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are gotten from China, India, and Brazil. Is there an opportunity for South-South cooperation to get those active pharmaceutical ingredient production technologies into Africa, so in fact we can make use of that? Biodiversity, yes, that debate continues. To what extent we can use medicinal plants. There's not much funding for that right now, but there's definitely interest. Of course, China is very advanced in using their own domestic medicinal plants, and they're supporting extraction of various pharmaceutical products. But in all of this, very complicated. You need a lot of health codes along the way to ensure safety. So standards and safety and accreditation of those laboratories to make sure that in fact those products are safe is a big issue, because as you know, I don't know for East Africa very much, but for West Africa, we have a lot of adulterated and fake products being imported in. So part of the work we're also doing now is how do you have this laboratory and systems to do testing, to keep those out. And a lot of those things are coming from outside of Africa, the adulterated and fake products. So how do you ensure safety is going to be a big issue in that supply chain?
Would you like to add anything?
No, I completely agree. I think that at the beginning stage, I think it's very important to let the private sector develop whatever niche that you could develop. And then I think it's important for the government to step in, try to understand the constraints facing, and try to facilitate the growth. Because otherwise, you know, the private sector within the short horizon cannot really survive without obsolescence.
I think the repeating message you're hearing, because I don't want people living here that they're advocating for government to be super active. We're talking about barrier removal, focusing on facilitation and barrier removal. Sometimes it's infrastructure. Some other times maybe it's standards, public goods that ensure a fair playing field, but also safety and good quality products. So it's those kinds of barrier removals we're talking about, and again, having some discipline in the supply chain.
In the interest of fairness, I'm going to take a question from the right-hand side of the audience, and then maybe we could take those two gentlemen over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this switched on? Oh, it is. Right, excellent. My name is David Roach, and I'm involved in some agricultural investments in Africa, which I think is very important. But about 10 years ago, at the turn of the century, people said, this is going to be China's century. And I took the rather opposite view, and I said, actually, no, it's going to be Africa's century. Why did you say that? I said, look, I remember China 30 years ago, and starvation was endemic, as it is in some parts of Africa. But I also know that the Industrial Revolution in England was created on top of where the natural resources were, like on the coal mines in the centre of England. I take the view that the next Industrial Revolution will be in Africa. Instead of shipping natural resources to China and back again, natural resources will be developed in Africa. Am I right or am I wrong?
I definitely advocate for value addition. In South Africa, they call it beneficiation of minerals. The South Africans are very serious about that. Rob Davis, the Minister of Trade and Industry of South Africa, and I did an article last May in Project Syndicate. We called it South of the Revolution. And part of our argument is exactly that African economies must look at beneficiation, adding value to agricultural products, but also adding value to mineral products. Now, let me tell you the catch. I was in Guinea recently visiting the government, and of course we see the rail trucks leaving with all the bauxite. Guinea is sitting on almost 30%, 25 to 30% of the world's bauxite. That's huge. And anybody in the aluminum business has a piece of that real estate. But guess what they say the bottleneck is? They don't have enough energy to smelt. But I do know people ship bauxite to Iceland because they have cheap geothermal. You know, President Greason has come to some of my meetings and we talk about this. I do know that in Dubai they're building an aluminum cluster to use natural gas. I know the Saudis are doing the same. So in Guinea, the argument is, well, they don't have enough power. Is there a strategic focus, therefore, to say, fine, in 10 years, we want to smelt? What would it take to add value? Which means the infrastructure and the energy, and do a better deal with the mining companies. For me, that's the way Africans should think now in this 21st century, because the lessons are there. Iceland is doing it. They're doing it in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and they're doing it in Saudi. I know because I work in those countries as well. We should change the thinking. And the comment I'll also make on agriculture, I mentioned before that our estimate is that we may have 60% of the uncultivated arable land, which raises this whole debate about land grab. I'm sure some of you are writing papers on that. My caution is that don't throw the baby out with the bath. I'm a PhD in ag economics. We've been looking at opportunities for attracting investment in African agriculture for 30 years. What the Africans must learn to do is to structure those deals properly, that it benefits your people, but it's not necessarily bad. But if you allow people to take land from local people without compensation, it's your fault. It's not somebody else's fault, because those same investments are heading for Asia. I know that. Yeah? In 2008, when we had the food crisis because of the high energy prices, I visited the Gulf. And governments told me, they said, we realize, you know something? We can have cash, but we will not have access to food because it will be held back when the prices go up. And it happened in 2008. So the government said, we're looking for joint ventures. And of course, Africa is a nice place, but they were also looking at Asia. So what I say to Africans, therefore, and which the work that the World Bank is doing now, let's look at best practices, how you structure those deals, protects people's rights, but also ensure sustainability and ecosystems management. So it may not be entirely bad, but that's also, if you're talking about comparative advantage, that's a huge comparative advantage for Africa, and we're very close to Europe going forward. Remember I mentioned, we need to increase global food production by 50% by 2030 to deal with that 8 billion people, 70% by 2050 to deal with the 9 billion. Real serious issue.
Mr. Hindin, would you like to add to that?
No, I think I agree. I think what is important in terms of developing natural resources is to look at the forward and backward linkages of the sector with the rest of the economy, and to the extent that you could create employment. I think that's very, very, very key. We're not advocating to not develop natural resources. We just feel that it's much more difficult to manage the national economy in the presence of natural resources. It requires a lot more sophisticated management than normally is the case. If you look at, for example, countries that are now doing well and that are based on natural resources, there are very few countries in the world that could come to your mind. One of them is perhaps Australia. Okay, now, how is Australia fully employ its labor force? Is it based on the mining sector? No. What did it do? It's actually developed the ancillary industries based on mining. So instead of looking at the ore and instead of looking at the mineral sector, it develops computer associated products such as software linking to the production of ore, and then it's selling. And that's how it employs its people. It's not so much, you know, as I mentioned before, how many people can be employed in exploiting mineral resources? Not too many. That's the problem.
As promised.
Thank you. I'd just like to put a question to Dr. Din. This is purely from a finance point of view. I know that most of the banks in Africa, the sort of average deposit profile is about sort of 30 days to maybe a year. And obviously, if they're going to go into longer term investments and production and so forth, that's not going to be sufficient. So the question I know looking at China, for instance, you have the Development Bank, the Construction Bank, the Bank for Agriculture, Communication Bank, etc., before you even come to talk about commercial banks. Commercial banks generally tend to, I think, encourage trading rather than production. Mm-hmm. The question I'd like to ask is, what do you recommend to African countries, especially, to focus their energy in finance, or rather to create an enabling environment for these banks to get into production? And I know you also mentioned that many of the countries, the private sector gets involved. But the problem is that before you talk about the production, you've also got to talk about preparation of the enabling environment. The infrastructure has to be in place. And I'm just wondering what you have to say about that.
Let me pick it up now. Yeah, I think there's something that I didn't mention in the discussion tonight, but if you look at the way the Chinese has actually financed their infrastructure, finance their industrial zone, you see that a lot of that is based on land. What happened is the local government have access to land, which they could use to sell to private entrepreneurs, okay, at a profit. They use a profit, some of that for developing infrastructure, some of that to finance the banks. I mean, in terms of their contribution to the central government, which then goes back to finance, you know, the banks, because most of the banks in China are government owned. Again, I mean, going back to, and so therefore I draw one of the conclusions I draw at the end was that we need to look at the circumstances of each country. In a way, I think if we link it up to the issue of development of mineral resources, the development of mineral resources in Africa would generate a lot of revenues and exports to the countries concerned. But if the government use those resources not for their own benefit, but more for the development of the SME, that is a good way to channel resources. But then again, I mean, going back to my point before, to me the problem in Africa with regard to SME is not that there are not enough SME. To me, there's too many small enterprises in Africa. To me, the key problem is how do you make the small become the medium and the medium become large, right? And that, you know, That's why the role of the government is important. The role of using resources, perhaps from natural resources, perhaps from the mineral sector, to help finance that. That's important.
We've talked a lot about the missing middle. So all those kids with the trays in their hands and the cottage industries, millions of them, but you don't have those medium enterprises in the middle. Also, even the financing for them. In the Asian Funds of Development, they've been looking at what they call mesofinance. Those enterprises that need like $150,000, not $1 million, or not microfinance 5,000 or 2,000. That middle, even the financial instruments are not there. And some bankers tell you it's more difficult to administer that. So for microfinance, you can shut your eye, give $1 million to an NGO, say, run it. The big guys, they're a handful, so you can deal with that. You can do all the due diligence. But that missing middle, as he says, and helping the small graduate, we don't have the financial products. I know there's a big void.
Is there a role perhaps to play for venture capitalists in Asia and in the West in providing that kind of seed capital?
There's a look at that now. There's a you can Google him, Hubert Danso. Hubert runs the Africa Investor. We were just in a program 2 weeks ago at the New York Stock Exchange. This is what he's trying to do now. He's bringing African businessmen to New York, Wall Street, and having them interact with venture capitalists, even people managing pension funds. He's done a series of this now. We were there this year to support him again, trying to see whether they can take a bet on Africa. But again, you need some of the same conditions we mentioned. These guys also want to pull out in 2-3 years. And they are looking at those rates of return. They see they're high, but the risk profile is too big. So now again, I hear a lot of discussion in the financial sector about de-risking instruments. Who can buy down the risk? We see, for example, in the energy space. We take one of our case studies now is Liberia. Everybody wants to help Liberia have power generation to give access to electricity. They have plans, they have a policy, and so on. But the risk profile of the country is too big. And when companies come in, they want sovereign guarantee. But there's a limit to how much sovereign guarantee you can give, because it changes your debt profile. So the question is, can we have new financial instruments so EIB or the IFC and others can buy down that risk? Similar to some of the same challenges with manufacturing.
Yeah, to me, venture capital is probably more applicable to new industries or to industries where there's a lot of unknowns in terms of operating, in terms of risk which are higher than normal. In many of these typical manufacturing work that we are talking about today, that I was talking about in my book, it really doesn't require higher risk than necessary in order to have a venture capital. So I'm not sure to what extent venture capital would be, especially for small and medium enterprises for Africa. So I don't have that much of a high hope in terms of having a new breakthrough in terms of venture capital.
This young lady in the front.
The population growth and climate change that the huge population growth and climate change that Africa is facing have a rather controversial subject. That's modernizing our agriculture through science and technology, and that is embracing genetically modified crops, which will place because of the population growth and climate change, greater demands on agriculture are being seen and witnessed right now when Africa is in poverty, adverse poverty, most of it. And wouldn't genetically modified foods help alleviate the problem? Because at the end of the day, most of the food aid is GM food. And many of African countries are supported by GM foods, so we can't say we're not consuming GM foods.
For sure, Africa must take a close look at genetically modified products and how they can use it for disease control, for crops that can grow in more arid conditions. And I know there are groups already working on that. The challenge again here is biosafety and the impact on ecosystems. But I would say that Africa needs to take a look and have a comprehensive policy on this, even at sub-regional level. I know, for example, Burkina Faso is looking at GM cotton. And you and I know some of that will be smuggled into Ghana as well, or into Mali. So if we don't have a good policy on biosafety, it will come in through the back door anyway. But it's a technology we can't ignore, given the numbers we see now. To make crops climate resistant, to deal with higher productivity that we need to deal with the projections of food production we see. So my answer is we should take a close look and work out the systems that, again, we're going to need for biosafety.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think that China's partnership with Africa has been beneficial. It has created demand for products from Africa that has also helped a number of economies there to grow very fast. Second, I know that China has invested heavily in infrastructure in a number of countries that is opening up and making those economies competitive. For sure, these partnerships can be much improved. They can look at investments also in manufacturing. That is going to be crucial in the next phase of China's cooperation with Africa, to look at how, in fact, as you saw in the presentation that was just done here by our colleague from the World Bank, how, in fact, China would be willing and able to work with African countries to delocalize manufacturing into Africa when their own wage rates go up. Yeah. And so we believe, and there are some estimates that have been done by the former senior economist of the World Bank, is that China could easily help create almost 100 million jobs in Africa with that kind of delocalization of labor-intensive manufacturing over time. And I think we'll get there.
Okay, well, that leads very nicely into my next question, which is regarding that kind of that workforce, that labor force. I mean, poverty in Africa is ripe, and this should lead also, one would think, to cheaper labor, entitling people to work for less. But that's currently not the case. What do you think is our biggest challenge in order to develop cheaper and educated labor, which would kind of attract more multinational investments and create more jobs?
Well, education is going to be crucial. We have to invest in education, but that education has to be aligned with the needs of industry. Basic education will be crucial, but also what I call skills formation. So vocational technical education, helping people have skills that they can use in productive sectors. It is those skills that will attract manufacturing investment in Africa. You need a workforce that has certain technical skills, not necessarily bachelor's or PhD degrees. And I think here we can learn a lot from the Germans. The Germans have been able over decades to develop apprenticeship systems and partnerships with industry, where the educational institutions have been able to produce young men and women that have the skills to work in factories. And these are not degrees, but they are certificates in certain technical areas to use key equipment. And so it is the backbone of German manufacturing. So their productivity levels are high, very skilled labor, because in some cases now we need very good engineering design and people who know how to use high technology. So the kind of education matters, not just mass education.
Of course, that's very true. And as a final question, in business strategy, the best weapon to success is to focus on one's competitive advantage. What do you think is Africa's competitive advantage in industrialization? And which industry or subsector do you think we should focus on first to drive industrial development and growth?
For me, I believe agribusiness is an important one. We do have the opportunity to capitalize on the projected demand for food that we anticipate. I give you another number from McKinsey that came out in 2011. They project that there will be 3 billion new people moving into the middle class, over 2.5 billion of them in Asia. Those people need more food, better food. They need all kinds of products, and I think Africa could capitalize on that market. That's a trend that will not change. Yeah. Their incomes will be between $6,000 to $10,000 per head. They need food. And I think we have the arable land, we have water resources, but of course we have to increase agricultural productivity. We have to manage water properly. We have to mechanize agriculture. And I think that's a major comparative advantage for some countries, also adding value to their minerals. Yeah. I believe the Southern Africans and some others who have oil and gas can look at downstream petrochemicals. We need some of that for fertilizer, but we need it for other products as well. So agriculture could be one, labor-intensive manufacturing could be another one, provided, again, we have the skills and the public policy in place.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Greatly appreciate it.
Okay, good.
Right, Mr. Flynn, thank you for joining us tonight. Right, just want to ask you a few questions. The first being, what would you say to the criticism that the major misconceptions regarding Africa in the world stage are due to the way in which the world media covers African issues?
I think that's a very fair point. I think that that misperception obviously has its roots in the way that that foreign media tells stories about Africa. I think we need to look at the reason why that is. I think that if you look at just the organization and the structure of most media organizations, they tend to follow a very a prescribed narrative, if you like, a very shorthand narrative. And that has a lot to do with the narrative that exists about Africa is a pre-existing narrative, if you like. We can take it back to the 1980s when there was a famine in Ethiopia. You had a pop singer, Bob Geldof, standing up and then making pop songs about it, and that became, it became a brand. It became an idea and an identity. It was a shorthand narrative, and I think that what has happened and since then, and obviously that was it existed. I'm not saying that it was a bad thing. He was, trying. It was in aid of a good cause, but that just embedded itself in a lot of people's minds, and since then. Again, news hounds, I'm one of them. We tend to look very much for the short and immediate story, and whether that's in some cases that might be conflict or war. So these things have become embedded in people's minds, but that is being counteracted by African voices, and I think that a big shift and a decisive change that's happened has been the advent of the internet. It's been the democratization of media, and now it's impossible to exist like we did 20, 30 years ago, where you could have an outside narrative, somebody else deciding what your story was. Now Africans are telling stories for themselves, so it's much harder for that narrative to take hold. Obviously, it still does happen, and people have misperceptions, but you just have to, now Facebook is telling stories, YouTube is telling stories, and people connect and they realize actually, some kid who's grown up in Abuja, a kid who's, growing up in Dar or Harare or Johannesburg, they're the same as me, living in London. This is the same as me living in New York or Tokyo. And I think that's for the good. So, unfortunately you are correct. Media has played but we need, a lot can improve. And I think, again, that's why I feel quite lucky to be a business journalist, in that I can tell a different story. I can tell the story of, just to echo the speakers tonight. It's like we don't want aid. We don't want, like basket weaving interventions. We want the big picture stuff. So we want to be treated as equals. We want to compete. So these are the types of stories that need to be told more of, and hopefully we can play a part in that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. The next question is, with the talk of Africa being an emerging continent yet again, what steps, if any, can be taken to ensure that the continent does not again become victim to a new scramble for Africa?
Well, I think that the important, in any event, the most important thing is, strong institutions. I think strong government, strong civil society, democracy, open free markets, the participation of all segments of society. These are the things, if you have a robust society, you'll be able to prevent that outside influence from being an insidious one. And I think you can just, to use an example, I think it's quite interesting to see how, the oil and gas experience, the energy experience you're seeing in certain countries. Nigeria, it's taken years, decades, to try and wrest control back to put in place the kind of infrastructure. I say the risk, the control of the population. We had a military dictatorship in the past, and it's a nascent democracy. It's taking time to develop these state institutions. Corruption is still endemic. It's still a problem. But President Jonathan's government is making steps to try and redress that balance. Still, those structural issues there, you contrast those to, say, a country like Ghana, or where you have already rising oil production since the last five or 6 years, but they had time to learn those lessons from their neighbors and say, oh yeah, okay, other countries unfortunately did not have a good experience with this. So how do we, and Ghana is a highly developed democracy, it has a lot of very strong civil society, and they were able to take an active role, and they were able to say, we're going to put in place legislation that prevents these things. We want that energy to be used domestically. You see it now with Uganda too. I mean, they discovered oil there 2006, major discovery. It's going to be one of East Africa's largest oil producer. But again, they've said, look, we don't want to suffer from the Dutch disease. We don't want the resource curse. We want to use that locally. So, and because of that, you've seen the Ugandan parliament blocking several attempts by President Museveni to pass through legislation that would, potentially, that they feel wouldn't be to the benefit of all Ugandans. So I think that's an important thing in everything. I think, we need to, as the speakers tonight highlighted, concentrate on developing those institutions, developing civil society, and that's a way to prevent the resource curse from taking hold.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's greatly
my pleasure.
Appreciated.
Thank you for yours.
Great moderating.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a few questions. The first one's a little bit long, so bear with me. In light of Africa's extraordinary service economy, evidenced by its second-to-none telecommunications sector, some economists believe that Africa has leapfrogged its industrialization economic stage and should instead focus on strengthening its service industry in order to maintain its growth pattern. What are your views vis-a-vis the service industry as opposed to the industrial industry? And do you think that Africa more than ever needs to go back to the basics and instead focus on its industrialization first prior to its service industry?
Thank you for asking the question. It's very, very relevant to Africa. Now, I don't think it's a question of either or. I think it's a question of both. Africa is a very diverse continent with many countries, 48 countries. Each country is different in terms of resource endowment, in terms of different constraints that it has to face. And so, for many countries, industrialization could only take place through manufacturing. If the countries, for example, have a lot of labor force, a large labor force, and an unemployment problem to solve. Okay, in that case, light manufacturing offers a very, very sound way to create jobs, not just jobs, but productive jobs, and to reduce poverty at a very, very significant and fast scale. On the other hand, there are certain countries that rely on services. Take the case of Botswana has tourism, right? I mean, in tourism is service sector, and there you could indeed try to promote tourism and create jobs. And so it's a question of the resource endowment of the country, and it's a question also of what stage of development the country is in, right? So that's
Africa's abundant natural resources have both been a blessing and a curse. What do you think Africans can do to balance their internal needs for growth with the world's demands for these very goods?
Yes, that's a very important question also. As I mentioned at the seminar tonight, I think natural resources offer both a blessing and a curse. The blessings because it's easy to get revenues, it's easy to get exports, but at the same time it's a curse because it's a tremendous challenge for any government to deal with the issue of governance, with the issue of distortions created by the mineral sector. Look at wages. If you have a large population to worry about, and the job creation by the mineral sector is very limited. You know, you have at most 200, 300 people to operate a mine, right? So what do the rest, how do you create employment for the rest of the labor force? So to me, it's important for African governments to maximize, to exploit the natural resources, but at the same time maximize the forward and backward linkages of this sector with the other subsectors. Okay. For example, if you have copper, like Zambia does, you could also help create jobs by developing the ancillary industries associated with copper, right? Or at the same time, you could also focus on using the resources, the revenues from the mining sector to develop the light manufacturing sector, the same way that that our book has outlined. Yeah. And I think that is that's more of a sustained way for industrialization rather than relying on mineral resources alone. Right.
Excellent, thank you. As the lead author of Light Manufacturing in Africa, what is your view on the most critical challenge Africa must tackle in order to develop its industries? In the book, we outline 6 major constraints. Okay, the 6 major constraints for light manufacturing in Africa are the lack of industrial land. Surprisingly, Africa has a lot of land, but there's still lack of industrial land. There's access to finance. That's another second constraint. Third one is input industries. There you have a lot of input, but it's not really in the form that can be processed easily. The fourth one is access to finance. And the fifth one is labor skill, and the last one is entrepreneurial skill. However, if you look at the overall economy, I think it's important to single out the commitment of the leader at the highest level. To us, that's very important because the government doesn't have to subsidize industries. The government doesn't have to intervene in the economy, but it has to provide a clear signal to the private sector that doing what they do best, meaning developing manufacturing, is in accordance with the country's objective, is something that the government should be, that the whole country should be doing. Yeah. Okay, is a clear signal and it's a clear encouragement for the private sector, and for that has to come from the highest level. Without that, it's impossible to develop. You spoke during your talk of the role that Chinese outside of China had to play in this development.
Yes.
If you want this intelligentsia group.
Yes.
Do you see the same patterns regarding Africans outside of Africa, these organizations that perhaps can help the continent move forward?
Yes, I really strongly believe that the overseas Africans can do a lot, just exactly as the Chinese, the overseas Chinese have done to help the industrialization in China. And this is one thing that I think the literature has not paid attention to. China's industrialization and modernization relies heavily on the skills, on the technology, on the ideas of the overseas Chinese. And in the same way, Africa is blessed with many, many very highly successful Africans abroad. And if utilized successfully, they can contribute a lot. And I think the message that I would like to pass on to the African diaspora abroad is that you should have realistic expectations. I mean, the host countries, you know, all developed countries, took centuries, if not decades, to get where they are right now. Okay, so you need to have a realistic expectation of your own country, and that's number one. Number two, I think it's important not to take a 0-1 attitude
meaning either you abandon your own country or completely merge into your own country without bringing any value added. I think there's a lot of responsibility for the overseas Africans to really make the change needed in Africa today. And finally, I think I would really welcome the opportunity for Africans to discuss among themselves. So the example of tonight is an excellent example. And I even, after this talk, I even have a stronger conviction that the overseas African can even do more to Africa than the overseas Chinese can do.
Well,
because you are very well organized.
That's a great endorsement. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.